The heater died at 11:47 p.m., right after my best friend Sophie told me she had never once imagined kissing me, which would have been easier to believe if she hadn't been wearing my hoodie and staring at my mouth like it had personally offended her. My name is Lucas Grant, 29, a freelance architectural drafter from Portland, a man who had built a quiet, careful life around not wanting things he couldn't keep, and Sophie Reynolds had been my best friend for 7 years. A middle school art teacher with copper-brown hair, she twisted into messy knots when she was deep in thought, and a rare talent for making every room feel like somewhere you might confess something you hadn't meant to say out loud, laughing with her whole face, remembering the small things. The coffee order you mentioned once in passing, the name of the street you grew up on, the anniversary of the thing you never talked about. So that being around her required constant, exhausting vigilance because she noticed everything, and eventually you started to wonder what she noticed about you. We weren't supposed to be alone in a cabin that weekend. It was meant to be a group trip, 4 friends, 2 cars, board games, bad wine. Maybe a hike where everyone pretended not to be winded. But Devin got the flu, Priya's mother slipped on ice, and my brother texted at noon to say sorry, rain check, which left 2 of us. A non-refundable deposit, and Sophie standing outside my building in a cream beanie holding 2 coffees and a paper bag of cinnamon rolls from Marcy's, saying we could either waste the deposit or prove we were emotionally stable adults. And I looked at the bag and said I was emotionally stable enough to drive, which is how it started. Innocently and stupidly, fueled by pastry and the particular brand of poor judgment that feels reasonable at noon on a Friday. The cabin was 3 hours east, tucked above a frozen lake behind a road that looked like nobody had remembered cars existed after 1983. And by the time we arrived, the sky had gone a deep bruised blue and snow was falling in the lazy cinematic way that makes people in movies make decisions they'll need several episodes to sort out. And Sophie stepped out, stretched her arms over her head, said, "Look at us. 2 adults alone in the woods, nothing weird about this." And I said, "You're making it weird." And she said she was acknowledging the weird so it loses power. And I said that had never once worked for her. And she pointed at me with a mitten and said it works on 7th graders. And I said 7th graders fear nothing. They're basically raccoons with Wi-Fi, and she laughed. And there it was, that old familiar pull in my chest. The one I'd spent years folding up and shoving behind sarcasm, because it had nowhere else to go. Sophie was beautiful, yes, anyone with functioning eyes could see that, but that was the least dangerous thing about her. The dangerous thing was how she paid attention. How if I went quiet she noticed, if I hadn't slept she noticed, if I was pretending that my divorce 2 years ago had only left paperwork behind and not a crater in the center of my confidence. She noticed that most of all, because my ex-wife hadn't been cruel, not exactly. She had just slowly become honest, saying she wanted bigger, louder. Someone less predictable than a man who measured kitchens for a living and remembered to rotate his tires. And when she left, she said, "You're safe, Lucas." But I don't think I ever felt chosen. And that sentence had lodged in me like a splinter I couldn't reach until I stopped trying, stopped choosing, told myself restraint was wisdom when really it was cowardice. And then there was Sophie, who had a way of simply existing beside me that made all that careful distance feel less like protection and more like a longer way of letting go. Inside the cabin, the first problem revealed itself immediately. One bed, a sagging love seat beneath a moose painting, and Sophie walking slowly into the bedroom and turning around and raising her eyebrows at me until I volunteered for the couch, which she called a decorative punishment designed for a mildly depressed ferret, and I said some ferrets are bigger than people give them credit for. And she smiled, but it softened before it reached laughter into something quieter. And she said you don't always have to make yourself uncomfortable so everyone else can relax. And I looked away and said habit, and she said I know. 2 words, gentle and unshowy, Sophie's specialty. We unpacked groceries and made grilled cheese in a skillet with uneven heat and ate at the small pine table while the snow thickened outside. And the cabin had old yellow lamps and mismatched mugs and a shelf of paperbacks with cracked spines. And it should have felt awkward. 2 people alone in a borrowed space with a complicated history and nowhere to look that wasn't each other. But it didn't. It felt like a life we'd accidentally stumbled into and weren't quite ready to leave. And Sophie kicked my sock under the table and said if we were a real couple, this was where she'd complain about the wrong diagonal on the sandwiches. And I said there's a romantic diagonal. And she said I must have missed that section in husband's school, and something flickered across her face before she looked back at her plate, and she said she didn't mean it like that. And I said it was a dumb joke, and she said for what it's worth, you would have made an excellent husband to someone who knew what to do with steady, and I laughed quiet and once. And she said she'd never embroider it. She'd hot glue it badly and give it in a plastic bag. And our eyes met across the table, and the room shifted in that subtle way rooms do when the joke runs out, and the truth is still sitting there taking up space. Then the heater let out a metallic cough, rattled like a dying shopping cart, and went silent. For 20 minutes I followed every instruction in the binder the owners had left, reset breakers, checked connections, went outside with a flashlight to inspect the propane line, while snow found the gap between my collar and my neck with targeted precision. And when I came back, Sophie was crouched by the fireplace, holding a box of matches. And together, through considerable trial and one interval of crouching in silence, willing kindling to cooperate, we got a fire going, not a heroic fire. More like 3 small logs having a private disagreement, but it generated heat, which qualified as a triumph. Sophie stayed crouched close enough that her shoulder pressed against mine, the fire throwing uneven gold light across the hearth, her hair smelling like snow and vanilla shampoo. My hand braced on the stone an inch from hers, and neither of us moved to create more space. And after a while she said Lucas, and I said yeah, and she said have you ever thought about it? And I kept my eyes on the flames and said her name, and she said that's not an answer, and I said it's your name, and she said very good, you do know me. And I looked at her then. The teasing had softened into something more exposed, something that had stopped pretending it wasn't there. And before either of us could say anything more, her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and the screen was bright enough in the dim cabin that the message preview was fully, unambiguously visible. From Priya, so did you finally tell Lucas you're in love with him, or are you still pretending this is a platonic mountain retreat? Sophie went completely still. The little fire popped and shifted between us. For 7 years I had been careful with her, careful with my hands, my jokes, my glances, the way I stood next to her at parties. The particular discipline it took not to say certain things that had been accumulating in a room inside me. I kept the door shut on. And now, she turned slowly back to face me, eyes wide and embarrassed and terrified, and underneath all of that, still brave. The last warmth from the vents faded. She opened the blanket with slightly trembling fingers and said, just get in, softly. I'm freezing. And I stood there like a man who had briefly forgotten how legs worked. And she gave a shaky, helpless laugh and said she wasn't asking me to solve calculus. The fire was small, the heater was dead, and I ran approximately the temperature of fresh bread. And that broke something loose in me. And instead of sliding under the blanket, I crouched down in front of her, and she closed her eyes and said, please, don't use the kind rejection voice. And I said I don't have one, and she said I absolutely do. I used it on that woman at Devon's birthday party when she asked if I wanted to go dancing, and I said I did want to go dancing. And her eyes opened, and I said with you, I wanted to go dancing with you. You were wearing that blue dress with the small buttons, and you kept stealing lime wedges from the bar, and I spent half the night talking myself out of asking, because I knew if I put my hand at your waist in front of everyone, I'd forget every reason I wasn't supposed to want that. And her lips parted, and I said I remember things I should not remember. I've been remembering them for a long time. And something shifted in her face. The panic didn't disappear, but something warmer moved through it. Something that looked like wonder or the earliest edge of indignation. And she said, "You absolute idiot." And I exhaled and said, "Fair." And she said, "3 years. How much longer were you planning to wait?" And I asked if she wanted the honest answer, and she said yes. And I told her. The night she helped me repaint my apartment after Elise moved out. When she showed up in ripped jeans with paint already in her hair, and said without preamble, "We are evicting beige from your life." And we painted until midnight. And she sang badly to whatever was on her phone, and I laughed for the first time in weeks. And at the kitchen sink, I had almost stepped into her arms and instead thanked her with careful, cowardly politeness and slept on the couch, because the bedroom felt like it still belonged to someone else. "I was a mess," I said, and she said, "You were kind," and I said I told myself I was confusing gratitude for something else, and she said, "Were you?" and I said no, and her breath caught. And I said, "But you deserved someone whole, someone who could reach for you without making you wonder if you were just the thing that made the loneliness quieter." And her expression sharpened immediately, and she said, "Do not decide what I deserve and call it selfless." And I said, "I know." And she said, "No, I don't think you actually do." And she pulled the blanket tighter and scooted closer, and said, "You think love is only legitimate when it shows up at the right time with no complications attached, no grief, no history, no fear. But people aren't rental properties. You don't walk through and assess the damage before you decide if it's worth committing to." And I said that metaphor escalated. And she said she was cold and in love with me, and her metaphors were working with limited resources. And in love with me. She said it plainly, not buried in a text preview, not wrapped in someone else's teasing. Just said it out loud to my face with her chin raised and her eyes steady, and the specific bravery of someone who has decided honesty is worth the risk of being hurt. And my chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. And I said, "I'm scared." And she said, "Of me." And I said, "Of losing you. Of getting this wrong and having it cost us everything we've already built." And she said, "Lucas," very gently, "you don't get to keep me safe by never reaching for me. That's not protection. That's just a longer way of letting go." And I looked down at her hand resting on the edge of the blanket, a small smear of yellow paint along the side of her thumb from some school project. Her hands always in the middle of something. And I had watched those hands make birthday cards and fix broken things and gesture wildly through stories. And I had thought about holding one more times than I would ever admit to anyone. So I reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and she didn't. Her fingers slid into mine and curled tight and adjusted until they fit. And Sophie looked down at our joined hands and said, "Oh," quietly. And I laughed under my breath and said, "Oh." And she said, "I think I may have significantly underestimated the hand-holding situation." And I said, "You've held my hand before." And she said, "Not like you meant it." And those 5 words went through me completely. And I threaded our fingers more firmly together and pulled gently and said, "Come here." And for once she didn't make a joke about it. She came, blanket and all, and settled beside me with her shoulder warm against my chest. And I wrapped an arm around her because she was cold, yes, but also because I wanted to. Because I had wanted to for the better part of 3 years, and was done letting it change without me having done anything about it. She made a small sound when my hand settled at her side, and I stopped and asked if it was okay. And she said, "If you remove that arm, I will commit an indoor crime." And the laugh moved through both of us, and she smiled against my shirt, and I felt it in my ribs, and we sat like that in front of the struggling fire, blanket around us. Her knees tucked against my thigh, the cabin cold and dark beyond the little circle of warmth we'd made. The love seat glaring from the corner like a jilted chaperone, and Sophie tilted her head back and asked what happens now, and I said I don't know, and she said honest, and I said an annoying. I know, but I don't want to rush us. I want to do this right. I want there to be a first date that isn't a survival scenario. I want to take you somewhere where the heater works. And she said extremely romantic prerequisite. And I said I want to know what this is before I say things I can't take back. And she was quiet a moment, and then said you're already trying to draft permits for this. And I said I like permits. Permits mean something is being built properly. And she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Or maybe I had never let myself look long enough to name it. Fond and exasperated and entirely certain. And she said, you know, most people just call it falling in love. And I said most people don't have 7 years of load-bearing friendship to account for. And she said, is that what you've been doing, load-bearing? And I said every single day, and she looked at me for a long moment. The fire shifted and settled. The snow fell without urgency outside. And then Sophie Reynolds, my best friend of 7 years, the most attentive and infuriating and quietly extraordinary person I had ever known, reached up and touched the side of my face with her cold hand like she was making sure I was real, and said softly, I like permits too, as long as you're the one filing them. And I turned my head and pressed my lips to her palm, and she made a sound that was almost nothing, just a breath catching. But I felt it everywhere. We talked more after that, about her dating people to stop comparing everyone to me, which hadn't worked. About sitting across from perfectly decent men at dinner thinking, Lucas would hate this restaurant's lighting. Lucas would have brought a better umbrella without making a point of it. Lucas would know I'm pretending to like the olives. And I said you've always hated olives, and she said they taste like disappointment soaked in salt water, and we laughed. And then she went quiet and said she'd been afraid that if she told me and I didn't feel it back, she'd lose the person she called first when everything went sideways. So she kept choosing almost instead, and almost was genuinely terrible. She did not recommend it, and I set my mug down and then hers, and I said I'm choosing you properly. Since we're in the business of saying things out loud now, and she whispered, what are you doing? And I kissed her on the rug in the pale firelight. And she came into it immediately, both hands in my sweater, no hesitation, no held breath. And when I pulled back, she followed me half an inch with her eyes still closed, which did considerable damage to my self-control. And she said quietly, you cannot say things like that. Choosing you properly. I am not emotionally equipped for that phrase. And I said I'd add it to the permit documentation. And she laughed and kissed me again, quick and decisive. The punctuation at the end of an argument she had clearly won. We moved around the small bathroom with the particular shyness of two people who had been unself-conscious for years and had suddenly become very aware of each other in space, brushing teeth, discovering we'd both packed the same toothpaste, finding reasons to look at the mirror instead of each other. And when I came back from the bathroom, Sophie was already in bed in leggings and my hoodie with her hair loose across the pillow. And she lifted the edge of the quilt with an expression trying very hard to be casual, and my heart did something that would have failed a structural inspection. And I climbed in, leaving a respectful inch between us, and she stared at the ceiling and said, wow. And I said, what? And she said, that inch, it's very courteous. And I said, I'm trying to be decent. And she said, I know. It's sweet, also completely unnecessary. And then she closed the inch herself, tucking her forehead against my collarbone and her cold nose against my throat. And every muscle in my body went still at once, and she sighed long and comfortable and said, fresh bread. And I said, you can't just keep calling me that. And she said, I absolutely can, it's accurate. And I wrapped my arms around her. Not as a habit, not as a precaution, not as the careful managed thing I had always made physical closeness into with her, but as a choice. As the man I had been refusing to be for 3 years finally deciding to show up. And she made a small, contented sound, and I felt it in the center of my chest like a key turning. And after a long while her hand moved slowly across my chest and came to rest above my heart, and she said, "Lucas." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "If you wake up tomorrow and need to walk this back, I'll survive it. I'm not made of glass, but don't do it to protect me. Don't be kind in a way that isn't true." And I pressed my lips to her hair and said, "I won't change my mind." And her fingers curled into my shirt, and I waited until I felt her attention sharpen and said soft, "I'm in love with you too." And she went completely still, not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of someone who has just heard something they had stopped letting themselves hope for. And then she tipped her face up. And in the faint blue-gray light through the curtains her eyes were bright and searching, and terrified in the best possible way. And we were close enough that I could feel her breath. And I had imagined our first kiss in approximately 100 different settings over the years. On her apartment stairs after too much wine, in my truck while rain made the windshield go blurry, at some crowded party where jealousy finally shoved me past my own caution. And I had never imagined it in a freezing cabin under 3 blankets, with her knee tucked between mine and her cold nose, brushing my jaw. And it was better than anything I had imagined, because she kissed me first, not because I didn't want to, but because I was still tangled in that last thread of old habit. The part of me that had learned to wait until the wanting became manageable, and Sophie had no patience for it. She lifted her hand to my cheek and whispered, "Lucas, please." And her mouth found mine, soft at first, careful, trembling at the edges, like something trying to hold its shape against the weight of everything it meant. And for one stunned second I couldn't move, and then the warmth of her lips registered fully, and I kissed her back. And I pulled her closer with one hand at her waist and one curved at the back of her neck, and she fit against me with an ease that felt almost unfair. Like the universe had been sighing patiently on the other side of a door we had simply forgotten to open, and the kiss deepened, unhurried and searching, deliberate. A conversation that had needed to happen for a very long time. When we finally separated, Sophie's eyes stayed closed a moment, and I brushed my thumb along her cheekbone and asked if she was okay. And she said she was deciding whether to be romantic or insufferably smug, and I said she could be both simultaneously, and she said she contained multitudes. And then she pressed her face into my chest and made a low, muffled sound of distress, and said she'd kissed her best friend, and I said I was there, I noticed. And she said, "What if she was terrible at it?" And I said, "Sophie." And she said, "It's a valid concern." And I said, "You kissed me and I forgot what state we were in." And she paused and said, "That good?" And I said I was completely certain I had feet but could not locate them on a map. And she laughed, genuine and helpless, and the remaining tension between us simply dissolved. We slept eventually, or something close to it, me waking because she shifted closer every time a log settled or a branch scraped the window, her hand remaining tucked against my ribs with a certainty that moved me more than I expected, happiness being vivid and a little disorienting, like suddenly having good lighting in a room you'd been navigating in the dark. At dawn, pale gray light filtered through the curtain edges, and Sophie was asleep with one cheek pressed to my shoulder, hair across the pillow with complete indifference to aesthetics. My hoodie sleeve pulled over her hand, and I watched her for probably too long before decency prompted me to stop, and her lashes moved and she said, "Are you staring?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "That's unsettling," and I said I'd call it devoted. And she said, "One kiss and you're devoted." And I said, "Sophie, that happened earlier than the kissing." And she opened her eyes fully then, slow and sleep-warm, wondering if I had retreated in the night, if I would find reasons, so I didn't give the wondering any room. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, then the tip of her nose, then the corner of her mouth, small and deliberate, each one a separate answer. And she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for 8 hours and smiled in pieces, then all at once and said, "Good morning, boyfriend," which landed somewhere between a joke and a question mark and something that felt underneath both like hope. And I said, "If you want." And she said that was easy. And I said I can make it harder. She could submit references, write a cover letter, and she said do emotional renovations require a permit. And I said extensive permitting, site inspection, load assessment. At least 2 rounds of revision, and she pushed at my chest but her hand stayed there after. And she said she wanted to, just so we were clear. She wasn't asking to fill the cabin time. And I covered her hand with mine and said I want to too, have for a while now, in case that wasn't abundantly clear from the declaration at midnight. And she said she just wanted it said in daylight. And I said it holds in daylight, and we kissed again, slower, unhurried, her lips tasting faintly of sleep and something that might have been the cinnamon rolls. Hunger eventually pried us out of the warmth, and we layered up like people preparing for a small expedition. And I got the fire going while Sophie wrestled with an ancient percolator making sounds, suggesting something either spiritual or mechanical was happening inside it. And she set 2 mugs on the pine table and looked around the cabin and said, "Welcome to our first date." And I took in the unwashed skillet and the emergency blanket thrown over a chair and the defunct heater lurking in the corner and said, "This is a date." And she said, "It has coffee. It has proximity that could not be avoided, and I'm wearing your clothes, which is either domestic or highly fashionable." And I said, "You've set the bar with great confidence." And she said, "The bar is exactly where I want it." We ate the remaining cinnamon rolls pulled apart with our fingers, because the cabin had produced exactly 1 clean fork. And Sophie had ruled that sharing utensils was too intimate for people who had, by her count, only kissed twice. And I said 3 times. And she licked icing from her thumb and looked at me with patient deliberateness and said, "You counted." And I said, "Precision matters. It's professionally adjacent." And she said she was going to exploit that at every available opportunity. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving the world blue-white and still. The lake below disappeared under mist. And for a while we sat on the rug by the fire drinking coffee stronger than either of us intended, shoulder to shoulder, letting the quiet be the whole conversation. And Sophie leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "Tell me something you haven't told me." And I looked into my mug and said, "When Elise left, I was relieved before I was sad." And Sophie didn't move, and I said, "I never said that. It sounds terrible to admit, but our marriage had been so quiet toward the end, not peaceful quiet. Just the quiet of 2 people who had stopped finding the words, every conversation a test I hadn't studied for." And when she said she wanted out, the first thing I felt shamed me for a long time. And Sophie's hand found mine on the rug, and I said, "I think that's part of why I didn't tell you any of this, because wanting you felt clean and honest. And I didn't trust myself to deserve something clean. I thought I'd contaminate it." And she said, "Lucas," very low and careful, "you can be relieved something ended and still grieve the shape it left behind. Those aren't contradictions. They're just how people actually are. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you someone who stayed too long in something that wasn't working and finally got out." And I said, "You always make room for people to be complicated." And she said she taught 7th grade. Complicated is where everything real lives. And I laughed, rough and unexpected. And she turned toward me and said, "My turn." And she told me about dating people to stop comparing everyone to me, not fair to them. She knew that while she was doing it, sitting across from perfectly decent people at dinner thinking, Lucas would hate this restaurant's lighting. Lucas would have brought a better umbrella without making a point of it. Lucas would know I'm pretending to like the olives. And I said, "You've always hated olives." And she said they taste like disappointment soaked in salt water. And she said she was afraid if she told me, and I didn't feel it back, she'd lose the person she called first when everything went sideways. So she kept choosing almost instead. And almost is genuinely terrible. She did not recommend it. And I set both mugs down and said, I'm choosing you properly, since we're in the business of saying things out loud. And she whispered, what are you doing? And I kissed her on the rug in the pale mountain morning, with coffee going cold beside us, and the smell of wood smoke in our clothes. And she came into it immediately, both hands in my sweater, no hesitation. And when I pulled back, she followed me half an inch with eyes still closed, which did considerable damage to my self-control. And she said quietly, I am not emotionally equipped for that phrase, choosing you properly. And I said I'd add it to the permit documentation. And she laughed and kissed me again, quick and decisive. By noon, the cabin owner had texted that the repair technician couldn't reach us until the following morning. And Sophie read whatever was in my face and raised one eyebrow and said, you're doing calculations. And I said, I'm assessing the logistical situation. And she stepped in and looped her arms around my waist and looked up at me and said, yes, Lucas. She was not afraid of another night here with me. And I rested my forehead against hers and said, neither am I. And for the first time in a long time, something that should have frightened me didn't. It just felt like a fact. By mid-afternoon, Sophie announced that the broken heater had become a third presence in the cabin watching us. And I said it's an appliance. And she said it has witnessed 2 confessions. 1.5 arguments and at least 3 kisses. It has context. And I came up behind her and wrapped my arms around her waist. Not because the situation required it, just because I could. Which was still a new discovery, warm and slightly dangerous. And she leaned back against me like she'd been doing it for years, and said this is entirely the heater's doing. And I said I'm prepared to thank it in the guest book. And she turned in my arms and said, dear cabin owners, your broken heater forced us to confront several years of emotional avoidance. The bed had adequate space for 2 people who were honest with each other, then ducked out of my arms and said, come on, walk the lake. We went down toward the frozen water in mismatched layers, and Sophie slipped on ice with a frequency that seemed statistically improbable. And I said I was beginning to believe some of these were orchestrated. And she looked at me with pure theatrical offense and said, you think I would fake a loss of balance for hand access? And I said, I think you are a woman of considerable resourcefulness. And she said that is both insulting and correct, and gripped my arm anyway and kept it. At the shoreline, the world had gone very still, white ice and dark pines, and a sky the color of an old bruise going pale. And Sophie stood with her shoulder against mine, looking out across the ice, like she was reading something in it. And she said, it's strange, how normal this feels, you and me here. And she looked at our gloved hands linked together and said she thought it would feel bigger, more alarming. And I asked, is it good strange or alarming strange? And she said yes, simply. And I understood exactly what she meant, because every small touch still arrived with a small shock of recognition. The feeling of stepping onto ice that turned out to hold your weight. Sophie looked back at the lake and said, when we go home, people will have things to say. And I said Priya will require a full debrief. And she said Devon will say he always knew. And I said Devon did not know. And she said Devon will say he knew. And I said Devon once believed oat milk came from the oats directly, like squeezing, and she laughed. And then went quieter and said, your brother. And I felt myself go still and wasn't fast enough to hide it. And Sophie noticed. She always noticed. And I said he'll be happy but he'll worry. Because after the divorce I was not what you'd call a delight at family gatherings. I was managed, going through the motions, and he saw it. And I don't want you to be cast as proof that I've recovered. I don't want anyone treating you like a sign that I'm functional again. And Sophie's expression did the thing it did, the softening that wasn't pity, just her paying attention and not looking away. And she said, then don't let them. I'm not a rehabilitation story. I'm not a vase you've placed on a repaired shelf to prove the shelf holds. I'm here because I want to be here, because I chose this same as you. And if people ask questions, we'll answer them. And I said together, and she said together back without hesitation, like the word had always been available, and she'd just been waiting for me to use it first. And I kissed her at the edge of the frozen lake, tasting cold air and the faint sweetness of morning cinnamon rolls, her mittened hands pulling at my coat, both of us slightly off balance on the ice, which seemed appropriate, and when we walked back up toward the cabin she didn't let go of my hand once, not on the icy patches, not when the path narrowed, not at all. That evening had the quality of something being gently practiced. We made pasta with jarred sauce and too much garlic, Sophie's addition and unapologetic. And she found 3 candles in a kitchen drawer and arranged them on the table with quiet ceremony and said ambience. And I said it looks like a seance. And she said we're summoning romance. And I said I thought romance was already present. And her eyes came up over the match flame and she said, is it? And I crossed the kitchen and took the matchbox from her hand and set it aside and held her face in both my hands and said, yes, it's here, not because we're snowbound, not because there's one bed and a heater with a grudge. It's here because I am in love with you, Sophie Reynolds, in full daylight before dinner, with the strong likelihood of garlic breath on both our parts, and her laugh came out breathless, and she said that may be the most structurally sound declaration she'd ever received. And I said I'd put it in writing, and she said, no, say it again. And I said I'm in love with you, and she said I'm in love with you too, Lucas Grant. And we stood there smiling like people who had forgotten how to do anything else, until the pasta boiled over with a decisive hiss and Sophie grabbed a towel with the speed of someone who had done this before. After dinner, we played cards on the rug, which is to say Sophie cheated with the serene confidence of someone who has never questioned her own methods. And I lost in a way more dignified than I deserved, and I said you have 3 queens, and she said she was popular, and I said that's not how card games function, and she said all rules are invented. Some of us simply have the vision to improve them, and I lunged for her cards, and she shrieked and rolled away, but the blanket tangled around her legs, and somehow we both went down anyway in a breathless heap on the rug, me half over her. Her hair fanned out beneath her like a copper halo, and the laughter drained out slowly until there was only quiet, her hands settling on my shoulders, light but not letting go. The fire popping beside us, and she whispered hi, and I said hi, and her eyes drifted to my mouth and stayed there. And she said this is a very compromising position for a man accusing her of card crimes, and I said I was prepared to negotiate with kisses, and she said that depends on the severity. And she said grave, several queens were involved, and I kissed her, beginning playful the way it always began playful with us, but the playfulness had teeth in it now, edges that hadn't been there before, her fingers sliding into my hair, my hand at her waist. And I had to pull back just far enough to remember I was allegedly a decent man with a functioning conscience, and I breathed once, twice, and she murmured, I know, her hands going soft against the back of my neck, and I said not bad, fast, just fast, and she nodded, cheeks pink, eyes warm, and I said we have time. And those 3 words undid me more thoroughly than any kissing could have, and I pressed my lips to her forehead instead of her mouth, and said we have time again, like a vow. And we untangled ourselves with clumsy giggling apologies into something almost sensible, her between my knees, her back against my chest. And she dealt another hand across our laps like this was the most ordinary thing in the world, and maybe, I thought, it was starting to be. Later, when the fire had burned to embers and the candles to stubs, my phone buzzed against the table. Elise, a preview visible across the top. Heard from your brother you're up near Pine Lake. Hope you're safe. Also, I found some of your old drafting books. We should talk when you're back. And a year ago, a message like that would have yanked me backward by the collar. Not because I wanted my old life returned, but because old wounds have a talent for disguising themselves as unfinished business. But tonight Sophie sat inside the circle of my arms, quiet and patient, trusting me enough to let me choose. So I turned the phone face down on the table, and she glanced back over her shoulder with no jealousy in her expression, just openness. And asked, "You're sure?" And I said yes. And she said, "You can talk to her if you need to." And I said, "I know," and kissed her temple and said, "But not tonight." And she traced idle lines along my forearm and asked, "What's tonight then?" And I tightened my arms around her and said, "Tonight is ours." And she turned inside the circle of my arms and kissed me, slow and certain, like an answer to a question I hadn't quite dared ask out loud. And later, when we climbed into bed, there was no polite distance, only Sophie curled against my side in the dark, her leg thrown over mine, her hand resting flat over my heart like she meant to keep it there. And just before sleep took her, she whispered, "I'm glad the heater broke." And I smiled into her hair and said, "Me too." And somewhere in the other room my phone buzzed once more, ignored and distant and forgotten, while the woman I loved fell asleep in my arms. Morning came with a knock loud enough to jolt Sophie upright, and she drove an elbow straight into my ribs on the way, and her hair stood in every direction, and she asked, "Did the cabin just knock?" And another knock came from the front door, and I said, "The cabin has manners," and she blinked at me one more sleep-fogged second, then gasped and yanked the quilt to her chin and said, "Repair guy." "Probably," and I said, "We look guilty," and she said, "We're guilty of sleeping." And I laughed and kissed her forehead and forced myself out of bed into air cold enough to feel like a personal insult. The repairman was a cheerful fellow named Hal who smelled like motor oil and peppermint gum, who stamped snow off his boots, took one look at the heater, and shook his head and said, "Oh yeah, this thing's dramatic," and from the couch Sophie whispered, "See, villain." And it took Hal 20 minutes, 20. After 2 nights of emotional collapse and life-altering confessions, and kissing my best friend under emergency blankets, the heater had simply needed a new igniter and a little encouragement. And when warm air finally pushed through the vents, I looked at Sophie expecting relief, and instead she looked almost mournful. And I crossed the room and crouched in front of her and asked if she was okay. And she nodded and tugged me closer by the hem of my sweater and said she knew it was irrational, but it felt like the cabin spell was ending. And I said there was no spell, just bad maintenance and snow and Priya's incriminating text. But this is coming home with us. And her expression softened and wobbled at the edges, and she said, "Promise." And I had learned to be careful with promises after my divorce, careful to the point of cowardice. But Sophie wasn't asking for forever in some reckless, desperate way. She was asking whether I would still choose her once there were roads again and phone signal and separate apartments to go back to. And I said, "Yes, I promise." And she leaned down and kissed me, warm and sweet and still half asleep. And Hal cleared his throat loudly from the direction of the kitchen. And Sophie called out, "Sorry," sounding not remotely sorry. The drive back to Portland was slow and bright, sunlight flaring off snowbanks, the truck's heater blasting like it had something to prove. Sophie beside me in my flannel with her hand tucked into mine on the console. And halfway down the mountain, the phones found signal and erupted, Priya requiring details, Devon claiming he always knew, my brother Caleb asking if we'd finally figured ourselves out. And Sophie read the messages over my shoulder and snorted, and said Devon didn't know anything. She would fight him, and then Eliza's name appeared again, and Sophie saw it too, and her fingers didn't tighten and she didn't pull away. She simply waited, which was exactly why I loved her. Not because she was never afraid, but because she trusted me enough to let me be honest. And I pulled off at a scenic overlook where the whole valley opened up below, all winter light and dark stands of trees, And Sophie said you don't have to do this right now, and I said I do, and I typed carefully. Thanks for letting me know about the books. You can leave them with Caleb or donate them. Hope you're well. And after a pause I added, I'm seeing Sophie now, I'm happy. And I hit send before I could edit it into something safer. And Sophie said seeing. And I looked at her and said dating felt too small and in love with felt like a lot to put in a text to my ex-wife from a mountain overlook. And she considered this and admitted it was fair and said she could send a correction. And I said no. And she said I like happy. And I lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles and said I am. And her eyes caught the winter light and shone, and she said me too. When we got back things weren't magically perfect. They were real, which was better. Priya got her details over dumplings the following weekend. Devon insisted he'd felt the shift between us years ago, which was rich from a man who'd once missed his own surprise party. Caleb hugged Sophie so hard her feet nearly left the ground, then pulled me aside and said, "Don't overthink this until you ruin it." And I said that was plan A, I'm revising. Sophie and I dated like two people who already knew each other's coffee orders, but still had whole, unexplored countries between them. I learned she hummed while grading papers. She learned I talked to stubborn cabinet hinges like they could be reasoned with. I took her somewhere with candlelight and white tablecloths, and she confessed unrepentant that she still hated olives. She dragged me to an art supply warehouse and spent 20 minutes explaining the emotional difference between two nearly identical shades of blue. And we had our first real fight 3 weeks in. Not loud, not cruel, quiet in the way arguments are when both people are trying too hard to be fair. I canceled dinner for a client deadline and Sophie went silent in that careful way that means hurt is trying to look reasonable. And the old version of me would have apologized and hoped the discomfort faded. But I drove to her apartment with takeout and said, I don't want to become the man who assumes you'll understand until one day you stop feeling chosen. And her face crumpled just a little. And she let me in, and we ate noodles on her floor and made a rule that night, no noble disappearing acts, say the fear out loud. Ask for reassurance plainly, because romance wasn't a single brave confession in a snowbound cabin. It was choosing each other again and again in kitchens and traffic, and exhausted Tuesday evenings that had nothing romantic about them at all. By spring, Sophie had a drawer at my place labeled in her handwriting emotional renovations, Phase 1, and I left the note exactly where it was. In June, we drove back up to the cabin, the heater working perfectly, which Sophie called suspicious, and we made grilled cheese on the diagonal. She declared romantic and drank wine while the sunset turned the lake gold. And later, we sat on the porch steps with a blanket and fireflies blinking across the grass like tiny sparks thrown off from a future I no longer had any reason to fear. And I said I used to think love was supposed to feel like falling, and she asked, and now? And I looked at our fingers laced together beneath the blanket and said, now, I think it feels like coming in from the cold. And she turned in my arms and kissed me, just as the first stars appeared over the water. And behind us, warm light spilled from the cabin windows, and ahead the mountains held the last deep blue of evening. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was borrowing someone else's life. I felt like I had finally stepped into my own. What would you have done if you arrived at a freezing cabin with only one bed, the heater broke, and your best friend told you to just get in? Have you ever experienced something similar? Tell your story in the comments.